Mega Campaign, Return of the Dragon Queen, Episode 31. Written by Flame Reptile. Written 4/27/26. This week's tale begins as the party stands atop the Skyland, Sky's Reach, peering down at the burned rubble that was once their keep, Manticore Tor. From a distance, they could see the wafting smoke, indicating something was awry at their home base, but never did they imagine that they would return to this. Maximus and Prinz, having little connection to the keep aside from a brief 1-month stay, peered down undeterred and uncaring. After all, they now controlled Sky's Reach, a flying fortress of stone. What was the true lost value of this place? It was undefended, obviously, and nearly a full day's journey to the nearest settlement. Beazle, however, grieved. He had claimed his own space upon Manticore Tor, stored many of his valuables, and had even sent a number of kobolds here to live out their lives in peace. Stunned, he waited to see the moves of his party before acting further. Alistair, having spent ample time within Sky's Reach, even helping to develop part of it, was oddly quiet. He didn't care for the keep and the land as much as the personnel within. In the silence, he recalled and tallied the denizens of the keep, hoping to see sign of them, but he did not. Alistair became even more still as he began scrying, attempting to look beyond his plain vision in search of Manticore Tor's denizens. First, Lady Blackhurst, his employer. He was sure she had contingencies for escape, as grotesque and immobile as she was, but he had to check. After moments, however, he saw nothing. No sight, no sign, nothing. Alistair was sure that nothing was the best possible sign here, an indication that she had likely escaped. Beazle and Maximus and Prinz stood and stared at Alistair, familiar with his form of silence, awaiting for a sign. Alistair drew his sight back into his body once more, and the three leaned forward in anticipation. "No sign of Lady Blackhurst," he said. "That's probably a good thing. Likely means she escaped." Before his allies could respond, or at least before he could hear, Alistair reached his sight out again, searching for the groundskeeper and his family. His vision was drawn high above into the clouds. There, Mr. Swift laid, his hands crossed over his chest, mouth agape, and eyes covered over by a wet cloth. His wife, Mrs. Swift, knelt over him, cleaning, wrapping, and tending the burns and cuts that covered his body. Tears fell from her eyes as she did so. It was evident to Alistair that Mr. Swift was in poor condition and would need medical attention sooner rather than later. He expanded his vision out as far as he could to attempt to get a better idea of where they might be. Safe, perhaps? He couldn't be so lucky. Only a few feet away, Mr. and Mrs. Swift's daughter clutched and hugged her two youngest brothers as they wept. The cold wooden walls that surrounded them provided little comfort. The only way in or out of their cell was a door fashioned from thick iron bars. His vision again returned to his body, and he said, "The groundskeeper and his family, they're in the clouds somewhere, locked inside of a cell." "Do you have any idea where?" asked Beazle. "No, just somewhere in the clouds," he replied coldly. Alistair again reached his sight outwards, this time in search of the shepherd, Ernest. Probably his least favorite of Manticore Tor's denizens after their unfriendly introduction months prior. His vision again took to the clouds, this time upon a skyship, docked within a cloud. Ernest stood amongst a familiar crowd, dozens of cultists of the Chromatic Queen, all adorned in gray robes, wearing wooden masks carved in the visage of a white dragon. Ernest wiped his brow and adjusted a pin placed upon his overalls, one signifying his recent adoption within the ranks of the cult. Did he join to save his own skin, or was it a prior arrangement? Alistair's vision again returned to his body. Breaking his normal character, he said, "That son of a bitch shepherd joined the cult." "Aw, shit!" replied Maximus. "Motherfucker," said Prinz. "That bastard," squeaked Beazle. "I really liked him." Alistair, Maximus, and Prinz seized their discontent to simultaneously stare at Beazle. "What?" He fed the manticores." Several minutes of slander towards the shepherd Ernest followed before Alistair again reached his sight outwards. Immediately, he was taken down into the smoldering rubble of Manticore Tor, where it stopped above a pile of torched beams and charred cabinets. Charlos, the turtle chef, was down there, and alive. Alistair quickly withdrew his sight back to his own body and dove over the edge of the sky's reach, calling out, "Charlos is down there!" Perplexed, the others fell in line and dove off in pursuit. As he fell, Alistair wove a spell into the air, allowing himself to safely land. He looked above as the descending prince produced an enchanted broom that he clung onto to slow his fall. Great white scaly wings unfolded from Maximus's back, while smaller translucent wings sprouted from Beezle's back. Both descended and landed as naturally as flighted creatures. Alistair and Beezle. Immediately, Alistair and Beezle began searching for the mound of rubble that concealed Charlos, while Maximus and Prince separated from the group to embark on different searches. Alistair was quick to find the mound that likely contained Charlos, pointing it out to Beezle, who dove headlong into displacing soot, rubble, and charred remnants. Beezle tore the detritus, throwing it left and right in his attempt to find and free the trapped chef. Maximus, however, began a search a few dozen feet away, hoping to locate the valuable books he had donated to the library of Manticore Tor, and the scryglass the party had left here months prior. The scryglass itself was a valuable artifact, but pure monetary value was not what concerned Maximus, rather its usefulness in scrying around Sky's Reach while they flew around the skylines of the coastlands. It would not take Maximus long to realize, however, the library of Manticore Tor was in as poor a shape as the rest of the keep, which is to say, it was burnt to a crisp. In fact, Manticore Tor, which was previously a 2-story building, stones lining the first floor and heavy timber framing the second, appeared as if its entirety was simply pushed over and set on fire. All except for, oddly, the basement staircase and door, which appeared as if it had been cleared out. Prinz. While Alistair pointed, Beezle dug, and Maximus meandered. Prinz ventured off to the newly constructed barn. Blinky and Beezle had spent a fortune to have it built, and at an expedited rate to accommodate that damned shepherd. It appeared intact from a distance, however much of a distance 200 feet was. Its doors were left ajar and the gates wide open, but not a sound could be heard coming from inside. Its floors were lined with dry straw. Honestly, a better structure to put to the torch than the keep. A single spark would send this barn up in flames that would lick the clouds, and with the hay stores nearby, likely the keep. There was no sign of life inside. No bleeding sheep, although the last time they had left there were over 200 of them. No growling manticores, for which the bleeding sheep were kept to feed the pair of them, and no shepherds, of which there were 3. Ernest had his 2 apprentices. The only signs that were out of place were a few small splotches of blood that marked the hay. Well, looks like they let all the sheep out, thought Prinz as he turned and left the barn. Alistair and Beezle. Alistair continued to point and direct the digging of Beezle, just in case he became distracted, or thought for a second that Alistair was not, in fact, contributing to the rescue efforts. After all, Alistair had been the one to actually find Charlos, or rather, where he might be. Growing out of breath and still an unknown distance from freeing Charlos from his ashy prison, Beezle stopped for a moment to open Vespa's hive, releasing 4 giant carpenter bees from the basket on his back. Sensing his intentions, the bees got right to work digging, aiding Beezle in his efforts. Maximus, with his curiosity taking over, and viewing it as the only remaining searchable space within the remnants of Manticore Tor, trotted down the stairs to the basement, leaving the door ajar at the bottom. The basement was dark, but his enhanced vision allowed him to see in shades of black and white and gray. At first, nothing appeared overturned or unusual, but upon closer inspection, that was because there was nothing left to be overturned. The whole of the contents of the basement appear to have been removed. Alchemy station, poisoning grotto, even the magical bulbs that provided light to the normally dark space. The only thing that remained within the basement was a small, flickering light at the far end. Prinz. Returning to the side of the ruined keep, Prinz took a moment to look over his peers, seething with hatred towards Beezle and Maximus for their draconic traits. They were distracted, he thought. This would be the perfect opportunity to jump them, to put them out of their misery, He pushed the foreign thoughts from his mind. Moments later, Prinz remembered there was also a servant's quarters on the premises of Manticore Tor. He looked east and saw it, a small brick building a few hundred feet off. The roof had collapsed in on itself, and smoke spiraled from its interior. Perhaps he could find some clue of what exactly happened here, other than the place being burned down. Alistair and Beazle. After several minutes of digging and supervision on Alistair's behalf, Beazle managed to free the shell of Charlos from the charred rubble. Seeing a handhold, he opted to attempt to pry the unconscious turtle from the ashes, rather than finish digging him out. Flexing his muscles, magically enhanced by the belt around his waist, Beazle grabbed onto the edges of the turtle's shell and hoisted him out, a feat of strength he would have been incapable of a few days prior. Proud of his contributions, Beazle held the massive turtle above his head as he trudged out from the wreckage to a nearby tree, setting him down gently. Alistair remarked, privately of course, that the trees nearest the keep and the other natural features surrounding it were remarkably untouched, given that the keep itself had been razed to the ground. He filed this thought away for future contemplation and continued to poke around the rubble. Maximus. Maximus trudged closer to the mysterious light and the farthest reaches of the basement. His eyes, unnaturally enhanced beyond his normal human physiology, adjusted to the change in light, and he could finally see the source. A single candle sat in a puddle of liquid before 4 barrels. One of the barrels had its side smashed open, and a glistening liquid trickled from within. Maximus, not exactly a thinking man, stared blankly at the candle as it burned down towards the liquid for a few moments before his attention was torn from the light to the sound of footsteps, shuffling across the stone floors, followed by the closing of the door, the metallic cling of a lock, and a soft thumping from the other side. Prinz. Prinz ventured forth from the ruins of the keep towards the torch servants' quarters. He gained easy entry as the door was nothing more than a shriveled, charred remnant, barely clinging to the stone frame. He peered around the space, torched into black nothingness. The remnants of the old furniture were almost unrecognizable, but more interesting than that, he also heard an odd sound, almost like that of a nervous breathing, coming from deeper within the house. Prinz crept around the corner into a charred bedroom, only to see a figure crouched in the corner. From the doorway, Prinz stood and stared at the gray-robed figure, and the figure, frozen in fear, peered back at Prinz through a white, dragon-shaped mask. It anxiously grasped a red tube with a string on the end of it, as its previously heavy breathing halted in silence. The two stood and stared at one another for a moment, contemplating their next moves. In a flash, the figure pulled at the string on the tube, but before he could finish its extension, Prinz had bounded across the room and snapped its neck. The final twitch of its muscles finished in death what it could not complete in life. A final tug at the string, which would trigger a chemical reaction within the tube, propelling a blazing red ball of light high above. Instinctively, Prinz's monastic training kicked in as he attempted to grab the ball of light before it could fly out of reach, but he was too slow. It was launched straight up into the clouds, casting a faint red glow from within. Alistair and Beazle. Beazle, having gently placed the unconscious body of Charlos a safe distance away from the fallen keep, laid his hands upon him and whispered a healing word. Radiant swirls of energy rushed from Beazle into Charlos, sealing many of his wounds and stabilizing the condition of the previously dying turtle. Alistair looked on into the rubble, curious of the oddly clear basement entrance that Maximus had disappeared into. A moment later, his interest would be piqued even farther as a gray-robed figure emerged. It walked out backwards after closing and locking the door to the basement. Alistair stared on, like a predator assessing his prey before pouncing, and the figure, which had not yet noticed him, began grabbing rubble and stacking it in front of the door. Alistair cocked his head sideways as the figure finished barricading the door and looked up at him through a white dragon-shaped mask. At the instant the figure noticed Alistair, it began to reach towards its pocket, but a smile stretched over Alistair's face as he conjured forth a fireball, engulfing the figure in flames. A moment later, both Alistair's and Beazle's attention was drawn to a red ball of flame, flying out from the nearby servants' quarters. Maximus. Unsure of what had just transpired, and disinterested by a slowly burning candle, Maximus bolted across the floor to the basement, to the door at the top of the stairwell. He turned its handle and pushed forward, but to no avail. He had been locked in the basement. But a mode of inspiration flashed through Maximus's mind. He could paint a door in the basement wall using his magical pigments and utilize his enchanted amulet to glide safely through the earth to freedom. So he did just that. Walking to the nearest wall, Maximus produced his magical pigments and painted a door across its surface. Magically, a door appeared before him, and he opened it into fresh, unworked earth. He then rubbed the magical amulet around his neck and simply walked through the earth, emerging above near Beezle. Alistair, Beezle, and Maximus. The party watched the glowing red ball of flame crest upwards into the clouds and disappear, leaving behind little more than a red glow. Moments later, however, cannon fire erupted from the sky. "Did that come from Sky's Reach?" asked Beezle. "It sounded like it," replied Alistair, "but I didn't think there were cannons on the island." "I didn't either," shrugged Beezle. "I got locked in the basement," said Maximus as he appeared from the ground near Beezle. "Where's Prinz?" "I think he went to check on the servants' quarters," said Beezle as he continued to provide medical aid to Charlos. Maximus nodded and stretched his wings, taking off and flying towards the servants' quarters to investigate the source of the red light and convene with Prinz. Maximus and Prinz. Prinz watched the ball of fire disappear for a moment before turning his attention back towards the cultist. He stripped it of its robes, wishing he hadn't as soon as he did, revealing the exposed nature of the cultist, and grabbed its mask. "These might come in handy," he said, as his attention was again drawn to the sky above by the sounds of cannon fire. He quickly dashed from the building to convene with the rest of the party and engage the source of the cannon fire. As he burst from the building, Prinz nearly crashed into the approaching Maximus. The two, having narrowly avoided a collision, stopped and nodded at one another. "Did you find anything?" asked Prinz. "I got locked in a basement. Found a candle and some barrels." "Ah, neat. I broke a guy's neck and took his robes," says Prinz as he produced the robes and mask for Maximus to see. Another round of cannon fire burst from above, but before Maximus could remark on the anticipated battle, an explosion rattled the hillside behind him. Both Maximus and Prinz turned to look at the cloud of fire, smoke, and rubble mushrooming back at the side of the keep. Beezle. Beezle continued to apply healing aid to Charlos, just bringing him back to consciousness. He gave the turtle a moment as his giant carpenter bees buzzed protectively around them and asked, "Are you all right? What happened?" Charlos coughed a few times and opened his mouth to speak. Alistair. Alistair walked forward as the flames subsided, leaving behind an unrecognizably charred body. He looked it over for a moment, but before turning his attention to the barricaded basement door. Perhaps he should have Beezle dig this out as well, or perhaps... Alistair and Beezle. Out of sight, a candle sat within a puddle of oil, flickering in the darkness of a musty basement. It had only come to life a few minutes before, and it was burning down quickly, dripping hot wax into the puddle of oil beneath it. If the candle was capable of thought, it might think to itself, why was there nobody here to enjoy the light it labored to produce? Why would somebody sit it next to these barrels of leaking oil? And where did that very odd-looking creature disappear to? Its final thoughts, before burning down into the puddle of oil it sat in, may have been, why have I been cursed to this short, lonely life, only to behold a single, unexplainable creature but for a moment? In an instant, Alistair, Beezle, and Charlos were bathed in burning hot light. Their skin and scales sizzled and peeled back as flames licked across them. Their eardrums were nearly shattered by the concussive force being pushed from the basement of the keep. Beezle and Charlos were thrown forward while Alistair, standing directly above a portion of the basement, was thrown upwards before falling down into the inferno. Everyone. The flames of the explosion cleared as Maximus and Prinz rushed to the site of the explosion. They found Beezle and Charlos prone at the foot of a now splintered tree. Maximus helped Beezle to his feet, while both checked up on the now dying Charlos. Prinz rushed forward to the crater, which was very recently a pile of burnt rubble atop a keep's basement. Inside laid Alistair, who opened his eyes and righted himself. Prinz called out, "Are you all right?" Alistair dusted himself off and began hobbling towards Prinz, walking up the side of the crater. "No, not really." Alistair approached Beazle to assess him, and Charlos, quickly noticing that Beazle was a little worse for wear, while Charlos needed immediate medical attention. "Neat. Now's a good time to show you what I've been working on," said Maximus excitedly. Now, Maximus was born a human, and until very recently was, in fact, very human. But due to some less than moral arrangements with a dragon of questionable repute, he has recently adopted some interesting physiological traits, his wings being one of these features. From his very human and well-defined back sprouted a large pair of white scaled wings. Another interesting feature that Maximus had acquired was a fluid-filled sac in place of his throat, which he could usually use to expel a freezing mist. Maximus reared his head back, inflating the sac on his throat and expelling a golden mist of healing energies that engulfed Alistair, Beazle, and Charlos. The healing mist closed many of their wounds and even stabilized Charlos from the brink of death. As Maximus tended their wounded party members, Prinz stared up at the sky, listening as the cannon fire ceased, and watched as a ship crested over the top of Sky's Reach. 7 ballistae followed behind the ship, falling from their mounts on the island. Shit, thought Prinz. They disarmed the Skyland. Prinz looked back over his party for a moment before making the decision to charge towards the skyship. It finished its arc over the Skyland and began to dip low towards the ruins of the keep. Like a madman, charging at an enraged bull, Prinz leapt into the air towards the ship. Spectral dragon wings erupted from his back, and they carried him up to the ship. Moments later, Prinz found himself atop the ship's bowsprit, amongst many enclosed barrels. He waited a moment to get his bearings, and formally come up with a plan of attack. Noticing Prinz's departure from the party, Maximus cut his healing breath short and took off in pursuit. As he trailed behind Prinz, he noticed 2 bodies strung up on the skyship's stern. At first glance, both appeared to be dead, no doubt victims of the captain's twisted will. But as he passed overhead, Maximus noticed shallow breaths from one of the bodies, noting that he may need to address the man sooner or later. In only a few fleeting moments, Maximus had joined Prinz atop the bowsprit, and the two began to formulate a plan. Prinz tore the top from one of the barrels, revealing an abundance of black powder. Immediately, Maximus produced a bag filled with oil, adorned with a nozzle with an unlit wick at one end. Months prior, Maximus had come into possession of several magical paint pots that would allow him to create physical objects of whatever he painted. He had won them in a painting contest, using his might as well as his creativity to ensure victory. While experimenting with the capabilities of the paints, Maximus had created an oil-filled bagpipe with a nozzle and wick at one end, in lieu of not having a sort of breath weapon like many of the other members of the party. He had envisioned lighting the wick and forcing the oil from the bag to create a jet of flame. Prinz's eyes grew wide at the side of the bag, holding his hand out and saying, "Maybe we blow the ship if everything else goes poorly. You know, as a last resort." Maximus nodded in agreement. Beazle, now refreshed from Maximus's healing breath, looked down on the still unconscious Charlos, laying his hands on him once more before taking off in pursuit of Prinz. Moments later, Beazle would latch onto the stern of the skyship, and nearly unlatch and flee once he noticed the barrels of powder and Maximus's flaming bag in the same vicinity. But before he could flee, his attention, and that of his companions, would be turned towards the door that separated the skyship's bowsprit from its forecastle. A figure opened the door and emerged, stopping only a step outside of the door. It was adorned in gray robes and wore a white mask, carved in the shape of a white dragon's face. The figure halted and stared as the three froze in place, staring back. The moment seemed like minutes to each of them, when suddenly, the figure pivoted, closed the door, and fled through the forecastle to the main deck. A moment later, shouting could be heard, alerting the ship of the invaders' presence. The two cannons mounted atop the forecastle above swiveled down, fixing upon Beazle, Maximus, and Prinz. Prinz chuckled. What are you going to do with those? As cannonballs slid from the cannons and plopped across the deck of the bowsprit. The cultists looked at each other, likely embarrassed at their foolishness before one spoke up, saying, You're under arrest. Prinz leapt atop the forecastle, immediately snapping the necks of the two cultists. He rushed forward to the other two with intent to kill, but his attention was drawn towards the helm. Maximus instead rushed forwards, breaking through the door in the forecastle. He threw his metal staff at one cultist, pinning him against the hull, and broke the neck of a second before recalling his staff and breaking through the second door onto the main deck. Before him, manning nearly a dozen cannons on the main deck, were dozens of cultists, but Maximus's attention was not drawn to them, rather to three figures at the helm. Beazle flanked the rail along the starboard side of the ship, peeking over the edge as the attention of the cultists upon the main deck were drawn to Maximus bursting through the forecastle doors. His attention, however, was quickly drawn to the helm as well. Spotting the captain and the two figures on either side of him, Beazle drew his blowpipe, aptly named the BB gun, as he loaded a specially bred bee from Vespa's hive, which sat upon his back. He considered his shot carefully. Should he take out the captain, the female to the left, or the male to the right? He decided upon the captain and took aim. The oracle, Valistra Frostvale, called out to Prinz, So nice of you to join us, traitor. Thank you for saving us the effort of docking and disembarking to capture you. She waved her hand over the crowd, and the cultists all drew their knives, readying for the battle. Across from Valistra, on the other side of the captain, stood her mate and Justiciar, Maelric's Ironscale. At her command, he drew his warhammer and snarled with malice at the ship's uninvited guests. Alistair lagged behind the party, being far frailer than his companions. He knew that if there was a possibility that the approaching skyship could come down at ramming speed, he would not be on the receiving end of it. Staying low to the ground, he flanked around the ship's path, ensuring his relative safely. As it passed by, he took off from the ground and pursued it, using his innate ability to walk along walls to adhere to its hull. Recognizing the latent threat that he posed, Valistra Frostvale stretched her hand towards Prinz, drawing a rune and chanting a spell. She attempted to assert her will over him, at the very least to simply hold him in place. A battle of the wills ensued, hers versus his, but still reeling from the presence of their surprise visitors, she found herself too distracted for her spell to take hold. Maximus leapt headlong into the crowd of cultists, kicking and punching at anything that moved. The hard sounds of snapping bones echoed across the main deck. Again, Valistra pushed her will against that of Prinz, but this time she was successful, shouting the word, "Stop!" Prinz froze in place, unable to move. As the oracle cast her spell, Beazle fired his BB gun. Imbued with every drop of primal magic he could produce, the bee exited its pipe at astounding speeds, trailing through the skull of the captain, leaving behind nothing more than a splatter of blood and a falling corpse. Seeing the half-breed whelp fire a magical dart, decapitating the captain, Maelric's Ironscale leapt from the quarterdeck, landing before Beazle. He began swinging his hammer. Once, twice, 3 times the hammer impacted Beazle, each time leaving behind a new wound, encrusted with ice left behind by the hammer. Maximus, unaware of Prinz's handicap, charged forth to the backside of Maelric's, waylaying on him from behind. But Valistra Frostvale had a trick in store for this regenerating monstrosity. Amongst the many mutations that Maximus had undergone in recent months, the mutation that is often considered to be his most useful is the ability to regenerate. Aided by a magical amulet he was in possession of, it had been determined that the only way to truly put Maximus down would be to douse him in acid to prevent his healing factor from functioning. Now, the eyes and ears of the faith of the Chromatic Queen stretched far and wide, and through less than honorable means, they stumbled upon this information. Valistra reached out her hand, conjuring forth an arrow of acid as it shot right into the back of Maximus. He could feel his greatest asset now becoming his greatest weakness. Maximus was vulnerable. Second after second, blows would be traded. Maelric's Ironscale would alternate between Beazle and Maximus in a knockdown, drag-out slugfest. Maximus would return blow after blow to Maelrix, and Beazle would try his best to escape, but fail time and time again. Alistair would attempt to sneak up behind Valistra Frostveil, conjuring forth his signature fireball to engulf her concentration in flames, but she would be too quick and too magically adept for such simple tricks. Just as fast as he could conjure the fireball, she would dispel it and return with a gust of freezing wind, knocking Alistair from the skyship. He plummeted for moments before using magics to teleport to the underside of the ship where he could administer aid to himself. While Maelrix would become distracted, attempting to rid the skyship of the latent dangers caused by Beazle's BB gun, Maximus would grab a hold of him, tear off one of his wings, and shove him from the side of the ship. Prinz watched on, unable to act due to the magics that held him, as cultist after cultist died by hands other than his own. Beazle would charge forward to attempt to rid the cult of its head and free Prinz from his enchantment. But as soon as Maelric's iron scale impacted the ground below, the magical amulet around his neck teleported him back to the side of Valistra Frostveil, and between her and Beazle. With a swift, powerful strike, Beazle dropped to the deck below, unconscious and on the brink of death. But to watch his teammate be struck down spurred Prinz on to break free from his magical restraints. Regaining his faculties, Prinz broke the necks of two cultists that had attempted, and failed, to shove his immobile body off the side of the skyship. Then he charged forward towards the Oracle and her Justiciar. In a few fleeting steps, Prinz appeared before the Oracle and Justiciar, delivering a stunning strike to each and preparing to wreak his vengeance. But that is where this week's tale ends, and next week's tale will begin.